So I think it's fair to say that whilst the acute sector are asking for flying cars and getting helicopters, we're still asking for a bicycle. So I think it's a great moment to come and talk to you, partly because the plan is coming out next week. But as you can imagine, I'm not going to be able to get into details about exactly what's in and what's not. But I think on these three shifts, and I'm going to start there, the Secretary of State has said himself many times, there's nothing new in the three shifts. No one's pretending that the three shifts are new. What really would be new and different would be actually doing them. And one of the things I reflect on a lot is if you take back in 2006, let's say, the government said the big strategy for the NHS is to shift care out of hospitals and deliver more care in the community. And at that point, hospitals accounted for 47% of the NHS budget. Then for the next, 18, 19 years, we did precisely the opposite of what we said we would do. So it's not that we didn't do what we said we would do, we actually did the inverse of our stated strategy, such that by this year, or by last year, it's now more than 60% of the budget is spent in hospitals. Now, I actually think mental health is a brilliant example of showing the scale of change that's possible. So if you were to look back in time, most of our care was in the hospital for people who were mentally unwell. And actually now, the vast majority of it is delivered out in the community. So actually, in a sense, the mental health sector is a trailblazer. And so I think when you see the stuff come out next week, remember that you're the example of where it was in fact possible. But if you look at some of the data and then you say, well, is it really possible at this point to change and can it really be done? I was doing a bit of analysis earlier this week and looking at other health systems and saying, well, how plausible is this kind of scale of shift? And I had a look at Denmark, and the reason I looked at Denmark is that the Danes are remarkably similar to the Brits. Age structure of the society is very similar. Smoking rates are within a percentage point of each other. Similar levels of problem drinking, similar levels of obesity. There's lots of reasons to believe that very similar populations. Their level of income inequality is obviously much lower because much greater redistribution, but broadly similar. They spend about 500 euros more a year on healthcare than we do, but it's close enough. We spend 4,600 euros in purchasing power parity. They spend 5,100, but it's in the same kind of ballpark. But how they spend their resources is radically different. So they spend 34% less as a share of spend on hospitals. We spend 61% of the budget on hospitals. They spend 40% of the budget on hospitals. They spend 31% more as a share of expenditure on primary care than we do. But the bit that's really stunning is that they spend 59% more on community and mental health. And so actually a kind of very different way of understanding and imagining the NHS is possible because you can see it in other systems that have similar populations, similar resources, and a similar health system structure. So I think in a sense, what will come out next week, hopefully, will be a kind of revolution in expectations. Like, what is the task? I think for a long time we've had a very hospital-centric system, and hopefully we will have a much stronger emphasis on care that's delivered in the community, care that's delivered in neighbourhoods, a much stronger emphasis on prevention and taking it really seriously. And of course, what we're talking about today, about the shift from analogue to digital. Now, on that, I want to just start in a perhaps unusual place, and I want you to picture for a moment two goldfish in a bowl. And one goldfish says to the other, how's the water? And the other goldfish looks back and just says, what are you talking about? Now, that analogy, that image was the starting point for a speech by David Foster Wallace, and it became an anthology, a very famous book, This is Water. And the point that he was making is that we all live in a world where there are a set of assumptions and norms that we don't necessarily see, but when we look at the goldfish in the bowl, we see two goldfish in a bowl of water. The goldfish don't see it that way, and that the injunction he gives is to keep saying to yourself, this is water, remind yourself of the world that you're in. And the reason that I start there, and I want to keep you to keep that image in your mind, is a bit about how we think about technology and its role, I've been thinking a lot about how do we approach the questions of technology and what conclusions do we reach from the approaches that we have. So I think there's quite a big generational difference. I always think about my dad has this habit that he'll do things like he'll pop down to the shops and he'll say to my mum, going down to the shops, if my phone rings, just answer it for me, right? And it doesn't occur to him that the mobile phone is something he can just put in his pocket, and the whole point is that when he goes down to the shops, he's got the phone with him. And it's not being forgetful, it's just that in his world, technology is fundamentally a supplement, right? It's something that enables you to do something you couldn't do before. That's quite good. He can see his grandchildren on FaceTime. He thinks that's great. But it's not a core part of his life. It's a kind of interesting supplement that does some fun stuff that, he couldn't do before. I then think, as you go down through the generations, that relationship begins to change. For sort of Gen X, I'd argue that the way that technology is seen is as a substitute. You say, well, there was one way of doing things before, I get that, and now I can do things in a different way. So, once upon a time, I might have rented a video from a video rental store, and now I can watch videos on Netflix, and one has just substituted the other, and I can just take one to the other. Then I think you get to the millennials, and for the millennials, who are all kind of slightly angsty, coming of age in the early 2000s, for the millennials, technology is sort of sacred. Don't take that thing off me. I'm kind of a bit addicted to my phone. It organizes everything, but it's a kind of sacred thing. It's very valued, but it's sort of sacred. I think the thing is that when you get then to the next generation, to Gen Z, the technology is the water. And I think the way that we keep thinking about technology is in a completely different mental framework. So we're either thinking of it as a supplement, we're thinking of it as a substitute. I think the virtual wards program is terrific, right? But even the name virtual wards, it shows a mental model that says, well, I've got this thing and I substitute it for this thing, right? And I supplement it. So I want you to think of technology as it's the water. And if you think of it as the water, it leads you to a totally different set of conclusions than if you think of it as a supplement or a substitute. So I kind of hear this debate that goes on about the extent to which, is technology having an impact on our mental health? And people tell me, well, you look at the evidence and I'm not sure it's proven, and, the problem is that people say this a lot, but it's anecdotal, and the studies that we've seen, they're not conclusive, and does it or does it not? But actually, if you take a step back and you say, the technology is the water, it's kind of absurd to imagine that it doesn't have an impact on our mental health. In the same way as a bit saying, well, do we think that, back in time immemorial, that being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, would that be a stressful experience? We think it would be, induce some stress and anxiety because it's a part of your life. Well, the technology is there. It's not something over on the side that's supplementing or substituting. That is actually the world in which people live. And so I think on demand, we have to think in a very different way about the challenges that technology presents. We all know that in terms of mental health conditions, there are some that are clearly have a genetic basis, there's a biological basis, no question about that, and actually for those conditions, they tend to be relatively stable prevalence over time. But we have seen an explosion in many other mental health disorders, and I think to imagine that these are disconnected from changes in technology and changes in the water is something that simply isn't true, and that we have to start thinking much more deeply about that. But then when you think on the supply side, if you were to ask the question of technology, if you think of it as a supplement to the real way of doing things, it's not quite the right way to imagine it. If you think of the technology as actually being something that enables not a much more efficient model of care, but a completely different model of care. And I think the idea there is not to imagine it just taking on individual tasks, but actually changing the way that it works as a whole. I was thinking a bit about, in the last few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about the impact of technology on safety. And I think if you were to make the comparison with other industries, right, when we have safety challenges, particularly with people who have severe and enduring mental illness, one of the things that other industries have is that technology forms a fail-safe. It's just much harder to make a mistake without having a system that flags it. But I think the other thing is that other industries make sure that they always have two sets of eyes on something that's high risk. You'll hear it when you go on a plane, right? You hear the captain go, doors, I don't think anyone's been on a plane, they've heard that they go doors to manual and cross-check, or doors to automatic and cross-check, or arm the doors. Now what that is that if you have the doors and they're set, for the flight, if you open the door, the emergency exit slide inflates. And the way that it inflates is a little small explosive fires the panel off the side of the plane, and this big, heavy slide pops out. Now that slide weighs many tons. So if you haven't turned that off and you open the door, you'll kill a ground operator, right? So it's actually a matter of life and death whether that door is set to open in an emergency or whether it's set for the airport, right? So it's not just that it will ground the plane, but it will, can actually kill someone on the ground. And so they have a process where the captain calls it, right? So it's not just left up to the cabin crew. And then they say cross-check. And so one member of the cabin crew disarms the doors, and the other member of the cabin crew checks that they've done it. So in that process, you've got an independent person who reminds you to do it, who's got it as part of their checklist for takeoff or for landing. You've got the person who does the task, and then you've got the person who checks that the task has been done, because it has such a big safety implication. You then have a sensor that says, is the door armed or disarmed? And that will set off an alarm for the captain to know if the door has been properly disarmed or not. Now, if you take that and then you apply it into our world in mental health, the reality is that we all too often don't have any of those things around areas of high risk, right? We don't have someone saying, I'm going to make sure this thing is done completely independently because it's a high risk. We don't have one person doing it, another person verifying it there. And we don't have the systems, the data systems, the technology systems to know whether something's happened or not. And so the challenge, if you take for many of our most seriously ill patients, is that our model has a single point of failure. So in many cases, our CMHTs, they have a single care coordinator who interacts with the patient. Now that single care coordinator who's got a single version of the truth, is also a single point of failure in the sense that they're the one who has to make the judgment about, do I escalate this or not? And when I led a homicide inquiry a couple of years ago, one thing that was really striking was, in this particular case that I looked very closely at, was that the care coordinator was incredibly diligent about writing up the notes. They had a really good, strong rapport with the patient. They were absolutely on it in terms of seeing them with the precise regularity with which they had said they would. And they clearly had strong rapport, right? They had a strong, good relationship. It was absolutely the right patient. The care coordinator was very committed doing the right thing. But the reality was that human factors came into play, and they just didn't see what was in front of their eyes. They didn't notice all of the signs of escalating risk. And that wasn't because they were a bad person, it wasn't because they were lazy, it wasn't because they were incompetent, it wasn't because they were not trained, it was because they were human. And because they were right there, and they saw that patient for months on end, and they really deeply cared about that patient, but because they had that close relationship, they were unable to see all the warning signs that were in front of them. And that is where I see some of this stuff on technology as having a really different role for us. So rather than just thinking about it as a question of kind of efficiency and booking and all of that kind of stuff and making sure, as the example was, that people can run around and go from, do an extra 2 appointments a week or whatever it is. It's to be actually able to deliver better, higher quality care. So in a future world where you had ambient voice technology capturing those conversations, you wouldn't have detailed notes going in because actually the AI would be capturing the conversation and synthesizing it. But the other opportunity is to solve that fundamental safety problem that we have, which is having a single point of failure of a single care coordinator, and actually be able to run algorithms and say, Where do we think there's an escalating risk? How do we solve some of those human factor problems to deliver better quality care for everyone? And the reason I go deep into that specific example is because I think sometimes with AI, there's a tendency to kind of waft it off. It always seems like it's in the future and it's going to do stuff in the future, but it's not quite grounded in the practice of care that exists now. And so I think it's things like that are going to be a tremendous opportunity. I also, by the way, I think one of the reasons that we struggle in mental health is partly because there has been chronic underinvestment in the core technology platforms to do the job well. I like to give the analogy of Amazon. So imagine Amazon. I don't know who here has Amazon Prime, but I suspect that some people have Amazon Prime, and they kind of bring stuff to your house within 12 hours or something. It was slightly shocking, like how did that manage to get here so quickly? All that kind of stuff, and it's all their logistic operation. Now imagine you had Amazon, but what they did was they got all their drivers together each morning. They said, look, here's your van. There's a load of parcels in the back. What we've got here's a printout, and we've listed all of the deliveries you've got to make today. It's listed alphabetically by surname. Off you go. Like, when do you think you would get a package, right? Like, just think about it, right? And yet, every day in the NHS, for several 100,000 people, right? It's not a few people, several 100,000 people across the NHS, every day, we're doing effectively that. We're saying, off you go, do your best, get as many done as you can. Now, in that, do you look at that and say, well, the problem is productivity and everybody should work harder? Well, should they put their foot down on the accelerator? You'd say, well, that's mad. Obviously, that's not the way to do it. There is a clear opportunity to improve our productivity by using technologies that other sectors already use, and to do it for some of the kind of quite mundane things, right? To have automated route planning, to be able to use ambient voice technology along with that kind of mundane, how do you plan the route, and the leading edge technology of ambient voice to capture the conversation, but also to do things like to improve safety for our staff. One of the risks that we have is that we have only one clinician seeing the patient. That's one risk. But there's another risk that's very real, which is we're sending someone in on their own into someone's house, and they're at risk. And I'm not saying they're at risk this is unique to mental health, right? This is absolutely true for community services. It's true for any job where you might go into someone's house and it's all inherently an unknown situation, inherently risky. And actually having a technology platform that could alert people to they've been here longer than we thought they should be. We know where all our staff are. The normal appointment time is 20 minutes. It's now been 35 minutes. What's going on? Right? So there's all kinds of benefits, but we need to get out of the mindset that says this is a supplement. This can solve just this problem. If this is the water that we live in, technology, then how can we completely change the way that we imagine delivering care? And what that can do in all of that is that by becoming more technologically intensive, there is this incredible opportunity to make care more human. Because actually, if we're using our time better, if we're capturing the data without having to enter it one finger at a time, we have the opportunity to not focus on the data, the administration, the mundane tasks, but to focus on the stories and experiences and lives of the person who we're trying to help. And I think that's the real promise of technology, is that in all of this, the promise and the potential is to deliver higher quality care and actually to revitalise and re-engage our clinical community in particular, and bring back a bit of the joy of work that comes from sometimes facing the most difficult situations, but being able to know that they've done the most to be able to help and done that with care and compassion. And that's where I think the real potential comes from analogue to digital. It's not new payment mechanisms and all that stuff that's important, but where it gets to at the end of the day is better quality clinical interactions, better staff experience, but fundamentally better care for our patients. I can leave it there.
Thanks, Tom. Now we have Emma Christie, who's Deputy Director for Mental Health in London.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Tom and Michael and Hassan, for such brilliant and thought-provoking presentations. I'm definitely not a digital health expert, but I hope you will trust me. So I just wanted to take this time, and Caroline very much sends her apologies. This is a hugely important agenda for her. She's hugely supportive of mental health in the capital, and I think that's clear from the kind of strategies and leadership we have in place around it. So that's the first thing to say. But I just wanted to briefly take some time together before we move to panel discussion to reflect on why we think London is such a great place and so uniquely placed to do transformation at scale in this space. So in London, we've got a unique set of assets that we have all developed together over time. We have innovative work already in place. We've got our incredible resources of providers, universities, world-leading research, health innovation networks networked across the capital. We've got our uniquely coherent structure. We've got a footprint that aligns with a single mayor, also hugely supportive of mental health, particularly mental health of children and young people. We have clear leadership and accountability in place across our region, across our 5 integrated care systems, and an ongoing partnership that is strong and will, I think, survive and come out the stronger on the other side of any change that we have to navigate over the next couple of years as we move to merge NHSE with DHSC as well. We also just have a great track record, and Cavendish Square Group is a brilliant example of that, of partners working together successfully to deliver change at scale. So I just wanted to dwell briefly on what the 3 shifts mean for London and how they are woven through our transformation strategy that we share together. So our ambition for London is that we have a healthcare system that supports people to stay healthy and very much focusing on reducing health inequality, that's working with partners and embracing and using digital technology to drive that change. Very, very committed to the principle of neighbourhood-based NHS and empowering people to take control over their own care. And we've definitely opened up a strong dialogue with our patients and with residents in London around different elements of care and the pathway through our deliberative engagement work in the urgent and emergency care space and in primary care. And we are very, very committed, as is evidenced by being here today in force, to the digital-first NHS across London. So very much nailing our flag to the NHS app as a digital front door for London, but thinking about what sits behind that and how that enables some of the kind of shifts and opportunities so ably described by Hassan and Tom and others. So our 6 strategic priorities, mental health is prominently in there, as is digital access. These are the priorities of our London transformation strategy. And that's really important because in a time of really ever-tightened resources, our 5 systems in London have made a clear commitment that transformation can, must and will continue. There is investment that sits behind this transformation strategy to help us put the resources needed to developing these important areas. Prevention, digital access, looking at joined up out of hospital care through better management of long-term conditions, looking at new care pathways and at-scale adoption of new digital pathways, and that's really very, very clear in our plans for mental health, and looking at how we improve and have a better and more coherent and consistent offer for our children and young people. And I suppose I just wanted to, the final slide is really to reflect on the unique assets that London has and our shared vision. So we have the London vision to make London the world's healthiest global city and the best global city in which to receive health and care services. And we do that through our collaboration, through our experts and leaders at Cavendish Square Group coming together. We do that through our strategic North Star, our London mental health strategy, which I'll talk about more on this afternoon in the context of digital for mental health and mental health online. And we've already got great examples of this work in practice. We've got 5 of our trusts now using the new One London mental health digital tool in terms of delivering the e-Mental Health Act pathway. We've got great resources through Good Thinking. Colleagues in North West London have developed the Best for You suite of resources, which is actually now rolled out across outside of England, in fact, in Denmark and other places. So we've got all the resource, we've got all the great resources and enthusiasm and skills in London. We just need to bring them together. And I suppose the final thoughts, and maybe we'll come to this a bit more in the panel discussion as well, I must always make a plug for mental health data quality in London, which is really impacting our ability to drive forward and tackle the unwarranted variation that we can see in our offer of care and hampering our desire to move to that consistent core offer for mental health across London. We've got our commitment to our transformation objectives from all of our systems, but every day we have to focus on that in the decisions we make and what we prioritise to make sure that we don't roll back from those commitments and we don't get stuck in the lack of resources, that we can continue driving forward and making each decision about promoting prevention or using the opportunity to capitalise from digital and really embrace the water that we're operating within now. I won't mention ambient voice technology because we have heard about that already, but that's just one example of how we kind of explore and deepen the benefits of AVT and use that to improve patient care as well as reduce our administrative burden. And I suppose the final thing to leave you with before we move to the panel is Caroline is really open to just hearing from you about what you need from us as an NHS London team, what else we can do together to support the shift from analogue to digital for mental health. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. So can I invite Tom Hassan and James Willard up to the stage for Q&A, please? So James is, just to introduce James, he's CCO at Oxley's and also one of the national advisors for digital mental health as well.
Thanks. It's particularly for Tom. Sean White, Deputy Medical Director, South West London, St George's. You're going to say I would say this, wouldn't I, because I'm Generation X. But the goldfish can't survive out of the water. How do we make sure that we don't, through the perspective that you're encouraging us to adopt, disempower clinicians and people around them so that they can't cope, can't deliver care if the technology fails? When Amazon's technology fails, I'll be inconvenienced because my parcel's late. But when my electronic prescribing system fails, patients don't get their key medication. How do we avoid that?
So it's a reasonable question, and I think, obviously we want to build in sufficient resilience and redundancy and make sure that there's an ability to respond to things like cyber attacks and all of that kind of stuff. There's no question that stuff is important. But I would say that, that part of adapting to modern life is having a reasonable expectation that the technology will work most of the time and planning for most of the time, and then having enough redundancy to be able to work when it doesn't work. But I think, we're not suggesting that clinicians should lose their core skills, right? There's no suggestion of that. So if you take some of the examples that I gave, right, in extremis, you can give the person the printed out list and say, off you go, right? Or you can write their name on a whiteboard and plan it that way and people can write it down with a pencil in extremis. But the extreme case of, systems collapsing because of a cyber attack and the technology suddenly disappears, I don't think that should prevent us from, the other 364 days out of the year that's not true for. And the other part is that clinicians will have their skills, and the core of their skills isn't coming from the technology. So I'm quite skeptical about the idea that a lot of these technologies are ways to just simply disintermediate humans from mental health. I just find it quite implausible. I think there are some things for mental well-being where you can use an app quite successfully to help maintain your mental health. You can use an app to track your mental health in order to identify when it might be deteriorating. I think to have an intervention that's going to help you, most of the time, that is still going to require a human, because we are fundamentally social creatures. We get much more leverage. You can have group therapy sessions that are run at scale in a very different way through technology, all kinds of opportunities. But I still think at the core of it, the real potential from technology is to enable us to be more human, not less. And actually, as a result, clinicians will always have to have that foundation of real clinical reasoning skills, because if you're going to make the job more human, I think fundamentally that will always be important. So I don't think I don't think we should plan for the extremes. I think we should plan for normal daily existence in care. The other thing I would say is, of course, we're already very reliant on digital systems, as are every sector, right? I mean, we could ask the question, what would happen to banking or to smart meters for water? Or, you could take any part of the economy and say, well, what would happen if you completely withdrew technology? I just don't think it's a scenario that we should prepare for, but I'm not sure it's a scenario that we should plan and design our strategies around.
Thank you. Really interesting question. I agree with Tom, but I just want us to think about medical school and the people that will be coming into and out of medical school who do not realize what it was like without the water. And I think that's where we're now going to start to think very carefully about how we train people for the future and not to lose the organizational memory that you have.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Shah Zamboob. I'm from NHS England and lead on digital mental health, digital workforce planning, and work very closely with James Bullard. So my question is around, all of this requires funding, and funding goes back to the point of business cases, and within that, the benefits element is quite essential. Now, many of the mental health pathways go through the acute sector, and many of the improvements that we make will eventually bring benefits, not primarily to mental health, but to the acute sector, and reduced A&E waits and fewer ambulances queuing outside, and fewer resources deployed by the LAS and partners like the Metropolitan Police, etc. How would the leadership within the mental health sector work with their colleagues within the acute to say, what we're doing is actually benefiting you, and when it comes to paying the bill, you need to sort of take out your checkbook as well, because it shouldn't be just the mental health footing the bill, it should be across the board. But we are not really sending out the message. So that's the question, really.
I mean, I can come in on that. I guess I just wouldn't do that, because I think one of the things we've got to snap out of is a frame of thinking that thinks that the purpose of why we do things is to relieve pressure on acute hospitals, because it just isn't. So we should do things to improve mental health, because mental health is really important for people. If there are spillover benefits, we're one NHS, and we should recognise and count the spillover benefits, and they may form part of the business case. Why would you do this? Well, we're going to get these kind of improvements, and they'll show up in different places. But I think it's actually really important that we don't frame trying to improve care outside of hospital as having its fundamental purpose as being about making life easier for hospitals. The fundamental purpose for improving care outside a hospital is that's where people live and work, and it'll be a better thing for their quality of life and for their experience if they get the care that they need in a timely fashion. That means that they can stay as well and independent for as long as possible. And if there's a kind of a beneficial side effect is that it makes our hospitals calmer and better places to work, that's great. But the core purpose is not that. The core purpose is to improve quality of care and quality of life for most people.
Claire McKenna, Chief Nurse, East London Foundation Trust. So I think you great talks this morning, and it's a really compelling argument. But the bit in my head is how difficult it is to actually get innovation. It's not even that great an innovation. So if I think about EOBS, we're probably on a pathway about 3 years, and we're still in blockers. So how can this and what we take forward help us to kind of navigate that? Because it's great to use innovation, but it's hard to see how we can achieve it.
Thank you so much. Allow me to give you an analogy from the hospital that I currently work at. So I'm at Great Ormond Street, and we have something called Drive. And Drive is an island. And the reason why it's an island is because of a very old philosophy around innovation, having a bridge to the mainland from the island. It's because the culture of innovation is so different to the culture of business as usual. And if you try and do innovation in an area where you're also trying to just do what you normally do, it doesn't thrive. So the separation is valuable. And when I consider your situation as an outsider, which is why I said I'm so honored to be here with you today, as a little bit of an outsider, what I think of is I'd love for you to have a group, maybe a shared group, that is thinking about, first, how to start the innovation, what you might call the ideation, and also, what do you do to get established solutions in? And their mindset is different. They've got different processes. Because if you have to use non-commercial and non-innovative processes to do these things, you will find it takes a hell of a long time. Everyone gets frustrated. I do think that that's required a little bit of separation. It's more about being smart than spending money. It's not about cash.
So I think standardization is an unwarranted variation in the way that we organize ourselves and provide care. And I would summarize that as, my experience is it feels like we have to solve the same problem 1,000 times rather than solving 1,000 problems once. And I think that, to me, is a summary of why we struggle. I agree with Hassan, we're not very good customers. We don't really know ourselves very well. So I think there are some sort of getting our own house in order will help us then engage, because we'll know what we need. We know the capabilities that we need.
May I make a very inappropriate comment at this point? It reminds me of Bruce Lee, right? And I think it was, I don't fear the person who's mastered 1,000 kicks. I fear the one who has done the one kick 1,000 times, right? And also be like water. But those are the two that came to my mind.
Yeah, sure.
Khaled Simmons, non-exec at South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. The NHS is full of smart people, great ideas, and lots of innovation that doesn't get realised or gets partially realised. Probably not enough islands with bridges, but also a very difficult capital environment to scale up new ventures. So even where there are entrepreneurial people, our accounting standards and so on prevent us from recognising multiple year investments and scaling up with external capital. The defence sector is pursuing trying to change that model by pursuing dual use. So they have a primary application within government and then or within the defence sector, and then try to find a second application for the technology to allow venture capital to come in and then have an early exit on that dual civilian use. Is that a model that we think could work in the NHS? Could we get venture capitalists involved to accelerate our innovation by giving dual tracks and accounting for an exit?
I mean, I can answer this very quickly. So venture capitalists, having been one, have the same problem. So the problem in venture capital in the UK is lack of scale-up capital. It's a precise mirror of the problem that you have in the NHS. So venture capital in the UK pays for lots of little businesses and gets them going, but in order to scale them up, they all pack their bags and ship over to the US. So it's clearly not a answer that we can just take from that, because they have precisely the same problem. So the UK has in general a problem with chronic underinvestments. If you look at investment, both public and private, as a share of GDP, it's been consistently the lowest in the G7. And that's not a new problem, that's a problem that's been going back about 40 or 50 years. So there's clearly a problem. You've seen some change to that, so the National Infrastructure Strategy puts a big step change increase in investment. I think within the NHS we have a slightly different problem, which is we have a sort of artificial split between revenue and capital because we treat them as two budgets. I think as a result, certainly my experience at the trusts that I was a part of, was that it drives you into making the wrong decision for the wrong reason. It's not that you're, making the wrong decision because that's the decision you want to make, but fundamentally, by artificially constraining capital, you end up having to put more revenue resources into doing the same task, and it becomes deeply inefficient. Now, I think it's going to be I'm not sure that we've cracked that problem. There'll be some progress in it, I think, that you'll see in the 10-year plan. But I think beyond that, we are going to have to work out a different way of managing capital, because partly what we've got into is that we've trained the system as a whole to think about revenue on one side and think about capital on the other. And as a result, because the revenue number vastly exceeds the capital number, we have a tendency to solve problems through revenue-type solutions rather than thinking about what's the total cost and opportunities. If you take an acute example, you see it with, well, we don't have enough diagnostic scanners, but we've got a massive team whose job is to manage the flow of patients through the diagnostic scanner. Well, actually, if you look at the total costs of having that team that manages this artificially constrained bit of capital, it would just be vastly more efficient to simply add another machine rather than having lots of people spend their time trying to do that and lots of patients backed up waiting in beds before they can get an MRI or a CT. So I think it's clearly a problem in the NHS as a whole, and we will need to find a long-term solution. And then once we have that solution, we'll need to change the mindset so that people approach a problem and they think about it in terms of, well, how could I use technology or investment in physical assets in order to solve that problem, rather than where we tend to be, which is we have a problem, the answer is, can we find more staff to put against it? And so I think getting that investment mindset into the NHS is going to be challenging, because there's been, I think this is since the kind of IMF intervention in the 70s, there has been this defined cash budget that is defined into revenue and defined into capital, and it's a long-term problem that will make some progress on, I think, now, but there's still a long way to go to sort it out.
So I'm going to, in danger of overextending Tom's water analogy, I think one of the things is also about this mind shift from analogue to digital when it comes to our thinking. At the moment, I guess, we look at technology as bottled water, and what we need to move towards is buying our water so we just turn on the tap and it's there all the time. It's that service, that's that difference between the technology in the corner and software as a service, where we're subscribing to a service that we're continuously being enveloped in that sense.
Thank you. I'm going to have to call a halt, really, because of time. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panellists today. So James, Tom, Sam, and Emma.